The house smelled of dust, old wood, and traces of the man they had buried that morning. Caleb stood in the parlor, listening as rain tapped against the tall windows. His relatives spoke around him, openly amused. "So, this is what grandfather left you?" His cousin laughed. Caleb looked at the cracked walls, faded curtains, and floorboards worn smooth by decades of footsteps. The house looked forgotten. "You should sell it," his uncle said, "before the taxes eat you alive." Another relative smiled. "You got the worthless property. We got the investments, accounts, and valuable possessions." They laughed together. Caleb said nothing. He had spent years being treated like the family disappointment. While others built businesses, bought expensive homes, and earned praise, Caleb had struggled to keep moving forward. Even at his grandfather's funeral, they had found another reason to remind him where he stood. His uncle handed him a folder. "There are debts attached to the house too. Honestly, you should be grateful if someone agrees to take it." Then they walked away, leaving Caleb alone. He tried to hide his disappointment. He had hoped his grandfather might leave him something meaningful. Instead, he had inherited a dying house nobody wanted. Then Caleb noticed the old walking stick. His grandfather's wooden cane leaned quietly against the wall nearby, beside a section of floor that looked slightly darker than the rest. Caleb stepped closer. He remembered that cane. His grandfather had carried it everywhere. Without thinking, Caleb placed one foot on the boards. A faint sound came from beneath him, hollow. He froze. His relatives were already disappearing through the front door. Caleb stepped again. The sound returned, quiet, deep. He stared down at the floor. Something was underneath it. For the first time that day, Caleb stopped feeling sorry for himself. The inheritance everyone had called worthless suddenly felt like a question, and Caleb knew he had to find the answer. Caleb spent the next hour walking through the house alone, listening to every creak beneath his shoes. In daylight, the property looked even worse. Dust covered nearly every surface. Paint peeled from the walls in long, curling strips. Several windows rattled whenever the wind pushed against them, and a cold draft moved through the hallways like the house itself was breathing. His relatives had not exaggerated everything. Bills filled a drawer in the kitchen, some years overdue. There were notices about repairs, taxes, and neglected utilities. In the dining room, an antique table was scarred and covered with a gray sheet. Upstairs, one bedroom smelled faintly of damp wood, while another contained a broken wardrobe and a mattress stained by time. Caleb understood why everyone wanted him to sell, yet something bothered him. The neglect did not feel consistent. The kitchen had been left to decay, but his grandfather's study was surprisingly clean. The bookshelves were dusty, but every book remained carefully arranged. A brass clock sat on the desk, still wrapped in a protective cloth. Even the curtains were preserved better than those in the rest of the house. Then Caleb entered the small room at the end of the hallway. There, everything looked almost untouched. A chair stood beside a polished wooden table. Old photographs remained neatly stacked. A lamp sat exactly where someone had placed it years ago. Caleb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Why preserve these rooms while allowing everything around them to deteriorate? He remembered his grandfather's voice from years earlier. "Never judge an old thing by how it looks, Caleb." At the time, the words had sounded like another lesson from an old man who valued patience. Now they felt different. Caleb returned downstairs and looked again at the damaged floor. His family had seen a worthless house, but his grandfather had chosen to leave it to him. Maybe the question was not why Caleb had inherited something worthless. Maybe the real question was why his grandfather had wanted everyone else to believe it was worthless. Caleb returned to the parlor before sunset, carrying a flashlight and the uneasy feeling that the house was watching him. He knelt beside the suspicious floorboards and ran his fingers across the wood. Most of the boards were dark, cracked, and worn smooth with age, but 3 boards near the wall looked different. Their grain was lighter, their edges sharper, and the nails seemed newer. Someone had replaced them. Caleb pressed his thumb against one corner. The board shifted. His heartbeat quickened. He carefully lifted it and found a narrow space beneath. At first, there was only dust and darkness. Then something metallic caught the flashlight beam. A tiny brass key. Caleb picked it up. A number had been engraved into its handle.
He stared at it for several seconds. Why? 1955. He searched the rooms, opening drawers, cupboards, and forgotten boxes. Nothing matched. Finally, he remembered the locked cabinet in his grandfather's study. He had noticed it earlier but assumed it contained old papers. The key slid into its lock perfectly. Inside were only two things: a faded photograph and a folded piece of paper. Caleb unfolded the note. His grandfather's handwriting stared back at him. "If they tell you this house is worthless, believe them only long enough to find the floor." Caleb read the sentence twice, then again. A cold sensation moved through him. His grandfather had known. He had known Caleb would hear the same insults, see the same broken walls, and be tempted to believe the house was worthless. More importantly, he had known Caleb would eventually find the floor. Caleb picked up the photograph. It showed his grandfather standing outside the house decades earlier, beside several men Caleb did not recognize. Behind them stood the same building, but it looked completely different. Freshly painted, carefully maintained, almost prosperous. On the back, another number had been written. Caleb slowly lowered the photograph. This was no forgotten inheritance. It was a message. And somewhere inside that ruined house, his grandfather had hidden the reason why. For the first time, Caleb understood that the people who laughed at his inheritance had missed something. Perhaps they had never really known what the house contained. Perhaps his grandfather had made certain of that. Caleb returned to the cabinet and examined everything inside with greater care. Beneath the photograph were yellowed property documents, newspaper clippings, and several brittle pages covered in his grandfather's handwriting. One document showed the house as it had been decades earlier. Caleb unfolded the hand-drawn floor plan and immediately noticed something strange. The current house had 6 rooms on the ground floor. The old plan showed 7. He counted again. 7. One room had disappeared. Caleb carried the drawing into the parlor and compared it with the walls. The missing room should have occupied the exact area beneath the section of floor that had sounded hollow. His pulse quickened. He returned for a screwdriver and began removing the newer boards. One lifted easily, then another. Dust rose into the air as Caleb pulled away the final plank. Beneath it was not dirt. It was a rectangular metal hatch. For several seconds, he simply stared. The house suddenly felt different. It was no longer an abandoned property filled with broken furniture and unpaid bills. It was something deliberately constructed around a secret. Caleb brushed away the dust and found a small iron handle. He reached toward it, then stopped. Something caught his attention near the back entrance. Footprints, fresh footprints. They crossed the dusty floor and disappeared toward the hallway. Caleb stood completely still. Those tracks had not been there earlier. Someone had entered the house. Someone had walked through the same rooms he had been searching. And if the footprints were fresh, whoever made them might still be nearby. Caleb slowly turned toward the dark hallway. The old house creaked. A floorboard groaned upstairs. He tightened his grip around the screwdriver. For the first time, the mystery beneath the floor no longer felt exciting. It felt dangerous. He looked back at the metal hatch. Whatever his grandfather had hidden down there had been important enough to erase from the official plans, and apparently important enough that someone else had come looking for it. Caleb stepped away from the hatch. He knew he should leave. Instead, he quietly locked the back door. Then he turned toward the hallway. If someone else wanted what was beneath that floor, Caleb needed to discover why before they found it first. Caleb did not touch the metal hatch again. Instead, he returned to the study and carefully checked every document he had removed from the cabinet. He remembered exactly where each one had been placed. One page was missing. His stomach tightened. He searched the desk, then the floor, then the cabinet itself. Nothing. Someone had moved it. His phone rang. It was his uncle. "You need to sell that house, Caleb." The words came without a greeting. Caleb leaned against the desk. "Why?" "Because it isn't worth keeping. You don't understand what you're taking on. You seemed pretty happy about my inheritance earlier." Silence. Then his uncle lowered his voice. "I'm trying to protect you." Caleb almost laughed. "You never cared about protecting me before." His uncle became impatient. "Just sign the sale papers, I'll find a buyer." Caleb looked toward the parlor. "No." He ended the call. That single word felt strangely powerful.
Hours later, darkness covered the property. Caleb stayed in the study trying to make sense of everything. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The old house settled around him with occasional creaks. Then he heard footsteps. Caleb froze. A floorboard groaned somewhere downstairs. He switched off the lamp. Another sound followed, a faint scrape. Someone was inside. Caleb moved silently toward the hallway and saw a shadow pass across the doorway. He waited, holding his breath. Then the back room went quiet. Caleb rushed toward the sound. A window stood open. Its latch had been forced. Cold rain blew through the opening, scattering papers across the floor. Caleb checked the house. Nothing obvious was missing. The cabinet was still there. The old documents remained untouched. Then he looked at the study desk. The photograph was gone. His grandfather's photograph, the one showing the house in 1955. Caleb's fear changed into certainty. Whoever had entered the house had not come for jewelry, furniture, or money. They had come for information. They knew something was hidden here, and somehow they knew which piece of evidence mattered. Caleb closed the window and locked it. Then he looked toward the floor. The secret beneath those boards was no longer just his grandfather's mystery. Someone else knew it existed, and they were willing to break into the house to keep Caleb from discovering the truth. Caleb waited until morning before opening the hatch. He had barely slept. The missing photograph, the forced window, and his uncle's strange urgency had turned the house into a question he could no longer ignore. He lifted the metal hatch. A breath of cold, stale air rose from below. Caleb switched on his flashlight and climbed down a narrow wooden ladder. His shoes touched a concrete floor nearly 8 feet beneath the house. The chamber was smaller than he expected. Shelves covered the walls, holding sealed boxes beneath layers of dust. Nothing appeared disturbed. It looked as though someone had locked the room and walked away decades ago. Caleb opened the nearest box. Inside were ledgers. Another contained old bank statements. A third held property deeds wrapped carefully in waxed paper. There were photographs too, dozens of them, showing land Caleb had never seen. Then he found the steel container. It was heavy, black, and secured with an old combination lock. Caleb set it aside for the moment and opened a ledger. The first pages contained names, dates, and purchase prices. Then Caleb saw something that made him stop breathing. His grandfather had purchased several parcels of land in 1955 for amounts that seemed almost absurdly small. Caleb recognized some of the locations. They were now among the most valuable commercial areas in the region. He turned another page. Newspaper clippings described a massive development project that had transformed the area decades later. Roads, shopping centers, offices, and residential communities had appeared where empty fields once stood. The value of those parcels had exploded. Caleb stared at the numbers. This wasn't a forgotten box of cash. It was something far larger. Ownership, land, assets that could be worth millions today. His hands began to tremble. Why had his grandfather hidden all of this beneath the floor? And why had the family never mentioned these properties? Caleb opened another document. Several lines had been crossed out in red ink. Beside them, his grandfather had written 3 words: "Never trust them." Caleb looked around the chamber. For decades, this room had remained untouched beneath a house everyone considered worthless. Now he understood. The broken floorboards were never hiding a useless secret. They were hiding a fortune, and someone had already tried to steal the first clue. Caleb carried the steel container upstairs and placed it on his grandfather's desk. The lock resisted his first attempt, then opened with a sharp click. Inside were documents wrapped in oilcloth. The first bundle contained original property deeds. The second held investment certificates. The third contained financial records spanning decades. Caleb read through them slowly, and with every page, his disbelief grew. His grandfather had accumulated far more wealth than anyone in the family knew. There were investment accounts, land holdings, private agreements, and ownership records connected to properties that had become extraordinarily valuable. Yet none of these assets appeared in the family's known estate. They had been deliberately separated. The house was not the inheritance, it was the vault. Caleb sat back, staring at the documents as the meaning settled over him. His grandfather had hidden a fortune beneath the floor and then left the entire property to Caleb. But then he noticed something troubling. Several property records contained transfer dates that did not make sense. Land his grandfather had purchased was later transferred to other names. Caleb recognized some of them immediately: his uncle, his aunt, even another relative who had laughed at the house that morning. Caleb's pulse began racing. He searched through another folder and found copies of old transfer agreements. Some carried signatures that looked wrong. Others had missing pages or handwritten corrections. One document showed a valuable parcel being sold for a fraction of what it was worth. Another showed ownership changing hands without any clear explanation. Caleb remembered stories from his childhood. His relatives had always said those properties had been sold because his grandfather's investments failed. But the documents told a different story. He kept turning pages. The deeper he went, the darker the pattern became. His grandfather had not simply lost his fortune, someone had taken pieces of it, and they had apparently done it while making the family believe everything had been legitimate. Caleb looked toward the ceiling, imagining his grandfather standing above this hidden chamber decades earlier, realizing the people he trusted were betraying him. Then Caleb found one final page. At the bottom, beneath a list of disputed properties, his grandfather had written, "They took what they could see." Caleb's eyes moved to the next sentence. "They never found what I kept hidden." The room suddenly felt smaller. Caleb finally understood the real question. It was no longer where the fortune was. He knew where it had been protected. The question was far more dangerous. Who had stolen the rest? Caleb spread the documents across his grandfather's desk and began rebuilding a story that had been buried for decades. The first clue appeared in an old ledger. His grandfather had owned several parcels of land before their value increased. Family members had repeatedly urged him to sell, insisting the properties were useless and that holding them was foolish. But the records showed something else. Some properties had been sold for remarkably low prices. Others had been transferred using documents Caleb now suspected were forged. Then he found missing pages. Whole sections had been carefully removed from certain files, as though someone had wanted the truth to disappear. Caleb felt anger rising inside him. His grandfather had trusted these people. They had used that trust against him. But his grandfather had eventually noticed. The records showed that he stopped discussing his finances with the family. Instead, he quietly moved his remaining assets into protected accounts and trusts. He separated ownership, changed beneficiaries, and preserved the original documents where nobody would think to search. Then Caleb found a sealed letter. His hands trembled as he opened it. His grandfather explained that he had considered exposing the betrayal, but feared doing so would destroy the family before he could protect what remained. So he waited. He built the hidden chamber. He preserved the evidence, and he chose the person who would eventually inherit it. Caleb read the final lines twice. His grandfather had written that Caleb had never asked him for money. He had never measured their relationship by wealth. When others visited seeking favors, Caleb had simply visited to sit with him. That was why the house had been left to Caleb. Not because he was the weakest heir, not because he deserved less, because he was the only one his grandfather trusted. Caleb lowered the letter slowly. For years, his family had made him feel insignificant. Now he understood that his grandfather had seen something they never noticed: character, loyalty, patience. The inheritance everyone had mocked was actually a final test of trust, and Caleb had passed it without even knowing he was being tested. But as he looked at the stolen property records, one thought remained. If his relatives had taken part of the fortune once, what would they do when they discovered Caleb had found the rest? Caleb took the documents to an attorney in town, along with an accountant who specialized in old estates and property records. Within days, their reaction changed everything. "These documents are significant," the attorney said carefully, "but we need to verify every transfer before you make any claims." Caleb agreed. He wanted proof, not revenge. But somehow his relatives learned what he was doing. The same people who had laughed at the house suddenly began calling. His aunt offered to help organize the inheritance. His cousin suggested they work together. Even his uncle sounded unusually concerned. "You don't want to make mistakes with something this complicated," he told Caleb. "Let the family handle it." Caleb remembered how quickly they had dismissed him. Now they were suddenly interested. He refused every offer. Then the tone changed. A letter arrived threatening legal action. It claimed that the hidden assets belonged collectively to the family and accused Caleb of withholding information. He read it twice. The threat was no longer subtle. Caleb placed the letter beside his grandfather's documents and felt a cold realization settle over him. The fortune was real, and it was large enough to make people desperate. He called his attorney. "I want everything traced," Caleb said. "Every property, every transfer, every account we can legally uncover." The investigation began. Old county records were requested, bank archives were examined, property histories were reconstructed, signatures were compared against authenticated documents. The deeper they looked, the stranger the story became. Several transactions appeared impossible. Some properties had changed ownership without proper authorization. Others had been sold for amounts that seemed deliberately reduced. And certain records had vanished from public files. Caleb watched the evidence accumulate. For the first time, he understood why his grandfather had been afraid. This wasn't simply a family dispute over an inheritance. It was a history of deception that had survived for decades. And now, Caleb was pulling it into the light. But every new discovery carried another risk. If his relatives had spent years protecting the secret, they would not simply stand aside while Caleb uncovered everything. He had found the fortune. Now he had to prove it belonged to him. The investigation took weeks, but slowly the missing pieces began returning. Archived county records confirmed the original property deeds were genuine. Bank records matched the financial statements Caleb had found beneath the floor. Even the oldest investment certificates could be authenticated. Then the contradictions appeared. Several transfers his relatives claimed were legitimate had never been properly authorized. Some signatures did not match authenticated examples. One property had supposedly been sold by Caleb's grandfather on a date when records showed he was traveling hundreds of miles away. The deeper the attorney searched, the clearer the pattern became. Fraud, deception, deliberate concealment. Caleb's grandfather had anticipated it. Hidden among the documents were references to additional evidence stored in separate locations. He had known that if someone discovered the underground room, they might destroy what remained. So he had created backups. The final pieces were found in an old bank archive and a sealed legal file. Together, they proved that several valuable assets had been transferred improperly. Caleb's relatives fought back. They claimed the documents had been misunderstood. They argued that the fortune belonged to the entire family and accused Caleb of manipulating his grandfather's intentions. But their own records betrayed them. Old financial statements showed payments they had never disclosed. Their signatures appeared on agreements they claimed not to remember. One relative even insisted that the disputed land had never belonged to Caleb's grandfather. The original deed proved otherwise. For the first time, Caleb watched the family lose control of the story. The people who had laughed at him in that dusty house were now sitting across from lawyers, trying to explain evidence they had believed was gone forever. Caleb remembered his uncle's voice. Worthless property, debt, nothing but a burden. Yet the very floor they had mocked had preserved the truth. Caleb didn't feel triumphant. He felt something quieter, vindication. His grandfather had trusted him to uncover what others had buried. Now the truth was no longer hidden beneath the floor. It was sitting in official records, signed, verified, and impossible to dismiss. The family could deny the past, but they could no longer erase it. The courtroom was quiet when the final decision was delivered. After months of investigation, archived records, financial evidence, and authenticated signatures, Caleb's claim was upheld. The hidden assets connected to his grandfather's estate were legally recognized, and several disputed properties were restored through settlements. Those responsible for fraudulent transfers could no longer hide behind old paperwork or family stories. The consequences were real. But when Caleb walked out of the courthouse, he didn't feel like a wealthy man. He felt tired. For years, he had believed his family saw him as someone who could never measure up. Now they knew the truth. He had never been the failure they thought he was. He returned to the old house that evening. The same cracked walls surrounded him. The same dusty windows reflected the fading sunlight. Nothing about the building looked extraordinary. Yet Caleb knew better. He walked slowly toward the parlor. Then he stepped onto the floorboard where everything had begun. The board creaked beneath his weight. He smiled faintly. Everyone had called this place worthless. They had laughed when Caleb inherited it. They had told him he had received nothing but debt and decay. But beneath that floor, his grandfather had preserved the evidence that changed everything. Caleb looked toward the hidden hatch. The money mattered. The restored properties mattered. The justice mattered. But they were not his greatest victory. His greatest victory was understanding why his grandfather had chosen him. It wasn't because Caleb was the richest. He wasn't. It wasn't because he was the most powerful. He wasn't. His grandfather had chosen him because Caleb had never treated him like a fortune waiting to be claimed. He had simply loved him. Caleb placed his hand against the old wooden floor. For decades, the family had judged people by what they owned. His grandfather had judged them by who they were. And in the end, that difference had determined everything. Caleb left the room and closed the door behind him. The house was no longer worthless. It was proof that some things become priceless only after someone finally understands what they were protecting. And Caleb finally did. Caleb could have demolished the old house. Instead, he restored it. He repaired the broken windows, strengthened the aging walls, replaced the damaged roof, and carefully preserved the rooms exactly as his grandfather had left them. The hidden chamber remained untouched beneath the floor, transformed into a private archive where every photograph, deed, and handwritten note could be protected. Caleb paid the house's debts and secured his future, but he refused to let wealth change the person his grandfather had trusted. He used part of the fortune to help families in his community, quietly funding repairs, scholarships, and opportunities for people who reminded him of his younger self. His relatives faced the consequences of their choices. Some lost properties. Others faced legal penalties. Caleb could have spent years seeking revenge. He chose not to. One evening, months after everything had ended, Caleb returned to the hidden room. The chamber was silent. He ran his fingers across the original floorboard where the first clue had been hidden. Something felt different. He knelt and lifted it. Beneath the board was a small envelope. Caleb stared at his grandfather's handwriting. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "If you are reading this, then you found what I wanted you to find," Caleb continued. "But remember, the fortune beneath the floor was only the first truth." He stopped. For several seconds, he could hear nothing but his own breathing. Then he turned toward the far wall. There, beneath layers of old paint, was a small mark he had never noticed before, a symbol, and beneath it, another date. Caleb slowly stood. The mystery was not finished. His grandfather had left him wealth, justice, and a legacy, but perhaps he had left something else too, something hidden deeper inside the house. Caleb smiled quietly. For years, everyone had believed the old property was worthless. They had been wrong. As Caleb reached for the flashlight and walked toward the marked wall, he realized the greatest inheritance might not be the fortune at all. It might be the truth still waiting to be uncovered.